So in a way, what Clare did, I think, is significant in particular for our time, because the discovery of what Clare did comes at about the same time as the emergence of feminism. Not exactly, but about the same time. And Clare, of course, doesn't make a very good, on one level, she doesn't make a very good companion for feminism, but on another level, she is opposed to sexism. And that's the way I treat her in my chapter. I've gotten a certain amount of criticism, and I knew I would, for saying that Clare is a reformer against sexism, because sexism as a term is a 20th century term. So Clare wouldn't have had the idea of sexism as a sort of, an idea of something that is some sort of thing. But you don't have to know the term discrimination to know that you're being discriminated against. And so that's the way I read Clare. She knows that women really are relegated not just to a secondary place. That's not the reform that Clare is concerned with. Women in the 13th century were not allowed to follow what are called the evangelical counsels. Poverty, obedience, and now for some reason I'm blanking out on the third. It's not humility. But anyway, they weren't allowed to have poverty. Women were not allowed to follow a life of poverty. You say, well, that's great. Who wants to be poor anyway? Right? But poverty is one of the evangelical counsels. And if you want to be perfect in the Middle Ages, and a perfect Christian in a sense, not perfect personally, but in terms of state, to lead a fully apostolic life, you had to be able to live a life of poverty. So by prohibiting women from living a life of poverty, the message is women can't be as Christian as men. Right? So that's the crux of the issue that Clare is dealing with. It's not the only issue, but I thought it might be the one that would be of the most interest to people today. So who was Clare? Well, she was born in Assisi to a noble family in 1193. Her father, Favaroni, was a member of a consortium, type of corporation of noble families that made collective decisions about property and how things were disposed of. These family corporations usually possessed fortified towers. So he's a nobleman, he's got fortified towers, he's part of this kind of conglomerate. That's probably too big of a word, right? But they control the economic aspects of their territory, and they're military men. In 1198, the merchants and guildsmen of Assisi revolted and drove Favaroni and his family out of town, burned down his house. 3 years later, in 1201, the nobles of Assisi attacked Assisi. They brought in the nobles from Perugia, I'm not really sure. I went to Italy once, and I tried to catch a bus, and I said, I want to go to Perugia. And the guy said, where? And I said, Perugia. He said, where? And then he just left me there. So I know I'm not pronouncing it the right way, regardless. But anyway, the nobles, they got some other nobles from a nearby town, and they said, okay, we can't let merchants and guildsmen do these sorts of things. And so they attacked the city, and they took back over. So there's no love lost between Favaroni and his family and Francis's family. Right? They were families that were, in fact, at war with one another. And that's significant, that Francis and Clare together, two families that had been at war over economic issues, join in this effort to lead a Franciscan life. Now, Clare's mother was this remarkable woman. She gave all kinds of money to the poor. She may have been helping Francis on the sly, because we know that the women of Assisi were helping Francis when he was rebuilding the church. And so it could be that Clare's mother is one of them, and likely is that she was. She went on a pilgrimage by herself, which was atypical, so she's a very devout woman. And Clare seems to have been really influenced by her, and so she decides early on that she's not going to get married, much to the consternation of her family, because I don't know if any of you ever seen that show, The Borgias, which, by the way, I don't recommend per se, but women in the Middle Ages, you marry them off to increase your property. So you marry them to some other family that has property or power or privilege in order to increase the family standing. This is what Clare is rejecting. No, I'm going to be a virgin. They didn't like that idea very much, but then she went and sold her dowry to make it harder for them to find a suitor. So she sold her dowry, and she refused to sell her dowry to her family because she knew they wouldn't give her a fair market price. And she wanted to give the money to the poor. So she sold it to somebody else, which enraged her family against her. And she did it anyway. Eventually she escapes. And I open this chapter really with this scene of her family coming. So she sneaks out. She lifts up this heavy bolt on the door because they live in this kind of fortified place. She sneaks out at night. She meets up with Francis. They take her off to a monastery where she can claim refuge. She enters the monastery, and then Francis takes off, right? Because Favaroni and his family would have just simply killed Francis right then and there if they'd had the opportunity. So Clare is by herself, a young woman. Her family rides in. They beat her up. They attack her physically. They insult her and they plead with her, and apparently, according to the story, which is probably pretty true, this went on for several days. They couldn't take her from the church because in the Middle Ages, she's got sanctuary. If they do that, they're going to get ecclesiastical sanctions against themselves. She's had her hair cut to show that she's taken on a religious life. She wraps herself up in the altar cloth so that they can't drag her out. That's how Clare starts her life as a Franciscan. Think of the courage that requires to face your family, to be beaten up. And these are military men. I'm sure that it was horrific, the experience of it. And she faces it by herself. And I thought that's really significant. She faces it by herself. She's called the little plant frequently, and if you read a lot of stuff that was written later, Clare just kind of disappears in the shadow of Francis. But I believe that Clare was a sort of, she is working with Francis. She and Francis together are creating a Franciscan form of life. She's actively engaged in that work, and she has her own ideas about it as well. So she joins Francis, and very shortly after, other women, noble women from Assisi, start taking on this life of poverty. And it really enrages the families if you think about it, because think about who these early Franciscans were. These are guys that come into town and they start preaching about penance, because they were a penitential movement, right? So it's Lent, good time to point that out. They come in, they're preaching penance. But what does it mean to preach penance? It means that you're coming in to tell people two categories. You could be admonishing people. To admonish people isn't to accuse them, it's to warn them. You're doing something wrong, and there are consequences. That's the kind of language of admonishment. It's a warning, it's not an accusation. Or they come into town and do an exhortation, which is to urge people to try harder to live a Christian life. But all penitential preaching is an effort at changing behavior. Whether it could be to change a problem with alcoholism in a town or village. It could be to address issues, which they did address in the Middle Ages, of what we call human trafficking. They had women that were forced into lives of prostitution at this time too. They might come into the city and speak out against that. Well, that would stir up an awful lot of opposition. So this is what they're doing as penitential preachers. And in the early 13th century, women were preaching. There was a tradition that you could preach ex beneficio, right? So there was official preaching, which would be doctrinal preaching, which only bishops could do, really. Franciscans started doing that, and Dominicans. But the rule was it's the bishop's province. Even most priests did not preach in the Middle Ages because they were not seen as having the skill to do so. And one might wonder whether that critique might still hold to some extent. I don't know how many homilies you've heard recently. But that was the idea. Only a bishop or his special representative, who had to be licensed. And actually, that's the origin of a Roman degree called the STL. You had to be licensed in order to preach. So most priests did not do that. So the brothers and sisters would come into town and they would give these penitential sermons. The problem was it also made them look like heretics. Because there were two groups of heretics. There were Waldensians, who were free preachers, and basically they were a lot like the Franciscans. They took on poverty, and they went out to preach, mostly kind of penitential things. But they received opposition from their bishop, and then they continued to preach even against their bishop's wishes. They found themselves condemned. I think Francis and Clare are both very aware, as a matter of fact, I know they're very aware of the Waldensians and the problem there. And it has a lot to do with how they set up their own approach. The other group are the Albigensians. And the Albigensians were kind of anarchic dualist, right? So they didn't believe in rules. They believed all structures were bad. In a way, if you want to think about a modern parallel, you might sometimes hear people say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. You know, I just have my own interior thing that I want to do. And that doesn't mean they're bad people, but in the Middle Ages, that was very threatening, as you might imagine, to the church. And so the church began to really emphasize the importance of the sacraments in particular as a way to distinguish between the Orthodox Catholics and these heretics. Because once the Albigensians were dualists, so they believed all matter was bad. And so they wouldn't participate in the Eucharist. So you could figure out who an Albigensian was by seeing who would go and take the Eucharist. And of course, if you turn out to be an Albigensian in the early 13th century, they burn you. And they killed all the Albigensians in the early 13th century. The Franciscans weren't really involved in that too much. It's mostly Dominicans. So, but that was the environment that Clare and Francis are in. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to be a critic. And yet, they're both critics. They're critics of the way the church is running. Because in the Middle Ages, people bought their offices in the church. So most of your diocesan clergy would have bought their office. They may not care at all about the pastoral care of the people. Fourth Lateran put into place a whole bunch of things that would lift up the importance of pastoral care, but it wasn't fully implemented. So the Franciscans come in with this penitential preaching in order to reform the clergy. Because if you don't reform the clergy, it looked like maybe the Cathars and the Waldensians might win. Because the church was discrediting itself so much with such bad behavior. The scandals were so awful that people were leaving the church in droves. And I don't know, that may sound a little familiar too. So this is what they're doing. Now in the 13th century, women, as I said, can't take on a life of poverty. And why is that? It's not necessarily that people were being evil or just wanted to put women down. There had been several women's communities that tried to take on poverty, and the end result was that the women in those communities starved to death. And those few instances were then used as the justification to say, well, look, women can't live poverty. They can't live by their own labor. They have to have established properties with rents and revenues. And that's the only way that women can practice religious life. So that's what Clare is responding to. She writes a new rule. Why is that significant? Well, she's the first woman. That's significant. It's also significant because the Fourth Lateran Council prohibited any new rules. So she writes a new rule even though the council says you can't. And then she gets some popes to help her accomplish that. So if we want to talk about strategy, if we can go to the next slide just a little bit. There we go. There are different ways that you can approach trying to reform the church, and all these three apologetics are the ways that reformers have done it. So if you look at the apologetics of perfection, which we're not going to talk about too much, this begins in the late 13th century, but it really takes on after the Reformation. So this kind of apologetic is one where we say as a church, we're the perfect church, and then any problem can't really be a part of the church. And so that's the way we're going to attack people who are not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not really part of the church because the church is perfect. And so if this person's a problem, ipso facto, they're not part of the church, right? And it's kind of a position that I find a little bit ridiculous. But there are still plenty of people who hold to that position in the church today. The second are the apologetics of decline and renewal. That's Renaissance. So the idea the church was perfect at the beginning, and then some bad things happened. Maybe it was Constantine, maybe it was the Fourth Lateran. Something happened, and everything went bad. But the earliest form of ecclesial apologetics are the apologetics of humility. And this is very pertinent to Franciscan approach to things, because humility is really the power that they used to lead their reform agenda. So this starts in the 4th century, really with Augustine and his fight with the Donatists. The Donatists were a group of people who left the church because they said, look, this church isn't perfect, and the church should be perfect, so we need to be just perfect people. And those people aren't really Catholic, we're the real Catholics. And they split off from the church. That also may sound a little bit familiar, because there are plenty of Catholics in the church today who would make that kind of argument. We need a smaller church, a pure church. We don't want all these problem people in our church. The problem is that then you don't have anybody in your church in the end, because we're all problem people. This apologetics of humility, if you could click the next slide, comes from Gregory the Great in a lot of ways. I mean, he's a pope, he's a doctor of the church, and he's not the first source, but he's the source that really transmitted this idea in a very powerful way. He explained that the people who reject the church because of its imperfections are the same kind of people who reject Christ because of the crucifixion. If you can't accept an imperfect Messiah, you're not going to accept an imperfect church. He sees it as the same sin. It's triumphalism in contemporary terms. And he says it's the recapitulation of the sin of Adam and Eve. Because what Adam and Eve really do is they deny their humanity. And they try to be something they're not. And so the people who reject the imperfect church don't recognize that they're imperfect and they need an imperfect church in order to move towards perfection. So this is a very deep rhetoric in the Middle Ages. Heretics, according to Gregory, fail to recognize how spiritual progress takes place. It takes place by bearing one another's burdens, by bearing one another's sins, by being patient with people, for example. So if you click the next slide, this spirituality, the main sources of this spirituality come from Augustine, Cassian, Gregory the Great, Peter Damian, Bernard of Clairvaux, Innocent III, Francis of Assisi, and then ultimately, in my area of focus, Bonaventure. The key understanding of this is based on the scriptural passage. God opposes the proud, but accepts the humble and contrite heart. So Gregory and all of these people saw that pride is the primary problem. If God accepts the humble and contrite heart, then you have to take a stance of humility. You have to, as a church, model humility, just like there is a poor and humble Christ. So why, this is the critique in the 13th century, why are the bishops wandering around with their bejeweled, fingers and their crimson robes and their bejeweled saddles and so forth? You see this kind of rhetoric all the time in the High Middle Ages. They're supposed to be following the poor Christ. And yet, when you look at them, they don't reflect that at all. That's what the Franciscans were trying to bring back. Let's understand what the poor Christ is all about. Let's understand what humility is all about. If you think about it, is it humble to refuse to admit that you made a mistake? Now, I've worked in church circles for a long time, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that a lot of clergy will never admit a mistake. They'll be nice to you after they did something wrong, but they won't say that they were wrong, and they won't ask for forgiveness because they consider themselves to be set apart and above. But how does that really reflect the humility that Christ was teaching? That's the kind of critique the Franciscans are bringing. Is it humble to claim perfection as a community? Is it humble to refuse to consider to change? Is it humble to refuse to apologize and admit failure? Right? So those are the kinds of issues. If the church could be more penitential, this is part of what the Franciscans are saying, and admit its mistakes and then try to make amends for it, it would in fact be a great light to the world. So they start from humility, and humility is deeply empowering. If you could, let's get to the next one. And I'm not going to read that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of humility. One way you can understand humility is it's the stripping away of your pretensions. We all have pretensions. We spend a lot of energy defending those pretensions. When you say, oh, well, this is my image or whatever. I don't know how kids talk today because it's not my world anymore. But, oh, I got to take care of my image, what are you doing? You've got a pretension that you're maintaining. You might spend money to maintain that pretension. You might get into fights and conflicts with people to maintain the pretension that you have. You spend a lot of energy on this, but if you let go of that, the first thing it does is liberate you from all of that. You're free. You don't have to protect something that's not real anyway. So that's first part, liberating in that. The second part about humility, the more subversive component of humility that Clare picked up on, is that once you let go of your pretensions, you don't care about anybody else's pretensions either. Whether they're a cardinal or a pope or a mayor, or a king. Once you let go of your own pretensions, as Scripture says, then you are no longer a respecter of persons. You're no longer a respecter of status. You can speak truth because you're no longer bound by this whole world that we try to construct. That's what the Franciscans were doing. So Clare and Francis, what they realized is there's this statement. Maybe we can skip another slide, and we'll skip past that. That's Clare chasing the Muslims away with a monstrance. And I guess the other slide, I don't know. So what are they trying to do with this humility? They recognize there's this claim that Gregory the Great makes, that we're saved by the people we despise. I think it's really important. We're saved by the people we despise. God uses the people we despise to save us. And despise doesn't necessarily mean hate. It means the people you think little of. You might hate them. It's the people that you think little of, the people you disregard. Gregory says, because pride is the problem, God uses those people to convert us. And he uses the example of St. Paul. St. Paul is the Slobodan Milosevic of, the first century. He's a killer of Christians. That's St. Paul. He's a murderer. Why did God choose St. Paul? Gregory says, to show everyone that there's never a reason to lose hope about anyone. Paul, the murderer of Christians. Paul's involved in the murder of St. Stephen, the first martyr. He's the one who becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. Why would God choose such a man? To strip away our own pretension, our own sense that we're superior to others. He says, we see people frequently we think we're better than, and at some point they pass us by. God does that to teach us a lesson. So we're saved by the people we despise. We're saved by the people we help. The people we help, in fact, are helping us. It's really at the core of Christian spirituality. You're not doing something good for somebody else just to do something good for somebody else. I'll put it in terms of the seminary. I used to teach in the seminary. I tell the seminarians, for some reason you need this. So don't think you're going out and doing all this stuff for other people and puff yourself up feeling so good about it. You need to be ordained for some reason. If you believe in Catholic theology, you're called to this. It's because you need it for your salvation. And you do help others. So in helping others, we're actually moving ourselves forward spiritually. But what Francis and Clare understood is that if it's true that we're saved by the people we despise, if you want to save people, you have to be willing to be despised. You have to be willing to be thought little of. You have to be willing to be thought of as insignificant if you want to save others. And you see, the reason that this was so effective for them is because the clergy at that time, what are they concerned about? They're concerned about protecting their rights and privileges. They don't want to give away the stuff that's theirs. And they feel the Waldensians and the Albigensians and these critics are trying to take away their power, their privilege, their property. If you want to help someone like that, does it help to begin to assert privilege? Or does it simply make them dig in? See, Francis understood that if you try to assert privileges in order to overcome people who are being driven into sin by their commitment to their own privileges, that would never work because they're going to see you as a threat. So what Francis does And what Clare does, Clare really so brilliantly in so many ways, is they give the honor and respect. They never claim privilege, first of all. They don't want privilege because they know what a problem that'll cause. Right? So they don't want any privileges at all because they know that's just going to engender incredible resistance. But the other thing they do is they show respect to these terrible clergymen. And I'm not saying that, but they're terrible. The 13th century, early 13th, we're talking terrible clergymen. They've got concubines, live-in prostitutes. They're beating up people. They're murdering people. They get involved. I mean, if you can go back and look at like the various, they had courts, ecclesiastical courts, all kinds of terrible things are going on because these are mostly noblemen who bought their office in the church in order to get an income. And so they're still acting like medieval noblemen, which means badly, right? I used to tell people, if you want to think about medieval noblemen, you would think about Favaroni and some of these other people. Have you ever seen that show, The Sopranos? This is kind of what we're talking about, They're like warlords, They go, I'm going to whack those guys over there because they did something to us. That's who these nobles are. And so when they become clergy, they're the same people. And frequently, families that had this kind of power, like Favaroni did, would also get one of their members of the family to be made a priest so that they control not only the political realm, but also the ecclesial realm in their territory. So what Francis and Clare do is they eschew all of that. And so first of all, that's a repudiation of the whole system. And then they give respect to the people who don't deserve it. And the reason they do that is their goal is to move them to conversion, to shame them. That's Clare's agenda, to shame the clergy. And if you look at like one of the things I say early on, I cite this thing that Cardinal Ugolino says, and he becomes Pope Gregory the Ninth later. He said, this is a quote, "And although I have always known and have considered myself to be a sinner, yet after having recognized a sure sign of your merits and having observed the rigor of your way of life, I have learned with certainty that I have been weighed down with such a burden of sin and have so offended the Lord of the whole universe that I am not worthy to be freed from earthly concerns and be associated with the company of the elect unless your prayers and tears obtain for me pardon for my sins." Clare. This is a cardinal in the 13th century, a man who was out of a family of incredible privilege, of very high status, very powerful, becomes the Pope. He says, I need you, Clare. I need you, your prayers and tears, for me to be saved. And then he goes on to say that he's going to entrust his soul to Clare, just as Jesus on the cross commended his spirit to the Father. It's a strategy in part, right? I don't want to say that they don't have a real commitment to humility, but there's a strategy that's involved here. And I'm not saying it's the only strategy that you can use if you're trying to reform a group, but it's a particularly good strategy in a religious context. Show the deference, show the respect, shame them into some sort of change. That's what the Franciscans were really doing, particularly Clare. Like the friars get involved in ministry. And that means they have to take on some privileges and so forth. And in a way, they, I think I think they still remain Franciscan, but they had to get involved in ministry. And once you become ordained, you have a status that's not quite being lesser, right? So Clare shames people, and she shames these clergymen into supporting her. And not only do they support her, they canonize her. And they send out a bull of canonization, and they use all this language of bishops to explain how good of an administrator and leader Clare is. So Clare disseminates this vision and was very successful in her own lifetime. The problem, of course, with what happened to the Franciscan sisters, and I'll end here for some discussion. What happened afterwards was that the decision was, no, this is too radical. Women who aren't strictly enclosed, we can't have that. Because all women religious had to be strictly enclosed. That meant they never left their monastery. Clare puts in her rule that they can leave for useful things. So within, a couple decades of her death, they suppress her rule, and they force all the sisters basically to become Benedictines. And it's kind of a sad story if it ended there. But what I believe, the way I read the history, because I'm a fan of the Franciscans, is that you look at what the sisters did. So some of them did become essentially Benedictines.